July 4th, 1963. A sweltering summer afternoon draped over Idlewild Airport in New York like a wet blanket. The air shimmered above the tarmac as Flight 2758, a gleaming silver Douglas DC-7 belonging to Transcontinental Airways, prepared for departure. Destination: Los Angeles International Airport, with 86 passengers and 8 crew members on board. Among those passengers was Thomas Calloway, a 33-year-old engineer returning home after finalizing contracts for a classified military communications project. His fingers drummed nervously against his leather briefcase as he settled into seat 14C. The documents inside were stamped with various security clearances, each one higher than the last. This was his 4th cross-country flight that month, but something felt different today. "Coffee, sir?" A young stewardess with carefully pinned blonde hair leaned over with a silver pot. Her name tag read Margaret. "Please." Thomas nodded, watching as she poured the steaming liquid into his cup. "Nervous flyer?" she asked with a practiced smile, noticing his tapping fingers. "Not usually," he replied, forcing a smile in return. He couldn't explain the unease crawling up his spine. 3 rows behind Thomas sat Eleanor Pearson, a 28-year-old teacher heading to Los Angeles to start a new life. The divorce papers had been finalized just yesterday. Her husband Richard hadn't even shown up to sign them in person. 7 years of marriage dissolved with a few strokes of a pen. The diamond ring that once adorned her finger now rested at the bottom of the Hudson River. "First time to California?" The elderly woman beside Eleanor had a kind face etched with decades of laughter lines. "First time anywhere in a long while," Eleanor replied, her Boston accent still thick despite her efforts to neutralize it. As the engines roared to life, Captain James Wilson made his final checks. A 20-year veteran pilot with over 15,000 flight hours, Wilson had seen it all, or so he thought. The weather report showed clear skies across most of their route, with some potential turbulence over the Rockies. Standard stuff. "Tower, this is Transcontinental 2758 ready for takeoff," he spoke into his radio. "Transcontinental 2758, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds 270 at 8 knots. The massive aircraft lumbered down the runway before lifting gracefully into the sky. Passengers watched through oval windows as New York's sprawling landscape grew smaller beneath them. Flight 2758 climbed steadily to its cruising altitude of 22,000 feet. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over Ohio, First Officer Robert Daly noticed something odd on their instruments. "Jimmy, take a look at this compass reading," he said to the captain. The needle was swinging erratically. "Probably just interference," Wilson replied, tapping the gauge. "Run a systems check anyway." Before Daly could respond, the radio crackled. "Transcontinental 2758, this is Cleveland Center. We're showing you deviating from your assigned course. Please confirm your heading." Wilson frowned. According to their instruments, they were perfectly on course. "Cleveland Center, we're showing on course at heading 270, altitude 22,000, negative. Transcontinental 2758, our radar shows you at heading 295. Please correct immediately." As Wilson and Daly attempted to reconcile the conflicting information, more instruments began to behave erratically. The altimeter fluctuated wildly. The radio emitted bursts of static. In the passenger cabin, Thomas Calloway stared out his window at the unusual cloud formation they were entering. It wasn't on any weather report he'd seen before departure. Dense, almost metallic-looking clouds surrounded the aircraft, reflecting sunlight in prismatic patterns. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Wilson's voice came through the cabin speakers, remarkably steady despite the situation. "We're experiencing some minor instrument irregularities and will be making a slight course adjustment. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Eleanor Pearson gripped her armrests as the plane began to shake. The elderly woman beside her had fallen asleep, somehow undisturbed by the increasing turbulence. Through her window, Eleanor could see nothing but thick, swirling fog. In the cockpit, all hell was breaking loose. Multiple systems were failing simultaneously. The radio produced nothing but static. The compass spun in complete circles. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Wilson called into his radio. "This is Transcontinental 2758 declaring an emergency. We have multiple system failures and have lost visual reference. Position uncertain." No response came through, just more static. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The turbulence ceased. The instruments froze. For 3 terrifying seconds, it felt as if the aircraft was suspended in nothingness. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the crisis appeared to end. Instruments returned to normal readings. The radio cleared. Outside, the strange cloud formation dissipated, revealing clear blue skies. "Cleveland Center, this is Transcontinental 2758, Wilson called. "We experienced multiple system failures but appear to have recovered. Please confirm our position." Silence. "Cleveland Center, do you copy?" This is Transcontinental 2758 requesting position confirmation. After several attempts, a different voice responded. Aircraft identifying as Transcontinental 2758, this is Denver Center. Please confirm your call sign and flight plan. Wilson and Daly exchanged confused glances. Denver? They couldn't possibly have reached Colorado yet. Denver Center, we departed Idlewild at 14:35 hours Eastern, bound for Los Angeles. We experienced equipment malfunctions over Ohio. Please confirm our current position. A long pause followed. Standby aircraft. Several minutes passed before the radio crackled again. Aircraft identifying as Transcontinental 2758 maintain current heading and altitude. You are being vectored for immediate landing at Peterson Air Force Base. Military escort is being dispatched to your position. Military escort? What the hell is going on? Daly whispered. Wilson keyed his microphone again. Denver Center, request clarification. Why are we being diverted to a military base? For security reasons. Stand by for visual contact with your escort within minutes. Two sleek fighter jets appeared alongside the DC-7. Their design looked ... strange, more advanced than anything Wilson had seen before. Thomas Calloway noticed them first among the passengers. His engineering background immediately recognized that these aircraft were unlike any in the current U.S. military arsenal. His blood ran cold as he instinctively clutched his briefcase tighter. As Flight 2758 began its descent toward Peterson Air Force Base, none of the 94 souls on board could have possibly imagined what awaited them on the ground. The aircraft touched down smoothly on the military runway. Passengers peered out windows to see dozens of vehicles surrounding them, including what appeared to be military police and several unmarked black sedans. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom, strained but professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed to deplane here at Peterson Air Force Base. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from military personnel. We don't have any further information at this time. As the cabin door opened, the first thing Eleanor Pearson noticed was a soldier's uniform. It looked subtly different, slightly altered in design from what she was accustomed to seeing. The second thing she noticed was the date on a digital display board visible through the terminal windows. JULY 4, 2023. The debriefing room at Peterson Air Force Base hummed with fluorescent lighting and tense silence. Captain James Wilson sat rigid in his chair, staring at the date displayed on the tablet computer in front of him. July 4, 2023. 60 years. 60 years had supposedly passed since they took off from Idlewild Airport. This is impossible, he said, for perhaps the 20th time in the past hour. This is some kind of elaborate hoax. Across the table sat Air Force General Diane Martinez, her salt and pepper hair cut in a severe bob that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. Beside her, a man in a dark suit introduced only as Mr. Collins from the Department of Defense watched Wilson with calculating eyes. Captain Wilson, General Martinez began, I understand your disbelief, but the reality is that Transcontinental Airways Flight 2758 disappeared from all radar on July 4, 1963. At approximately 16:45 Eastern Time, the aircraft and all 94 souls on board were presumed lost. After an extensive search found no wreckage. And now you're telling me we just what? Skipped forward 6 decades? Wilson's voice cracked with strain. That's what we're trying to determine, Mr. Collins interjected smoothly. What's the last thing you remember before the instrument malfunctions? Wilson described the strange cloud formation, the compass anomalies, the radio static, and the brief period of absolute silence before everything normalized. As he spoke, Collins tapped notes into his tablet. And no one on board is aged? Wilson asked. How is that possible? Martinez and Collins exchanged glances. That's classified information at this time, Martinez replied. In another room, Thomas Calloway was undergoing a different kind of interrogation. His military project knowledge, 60 years outdated, had immediately flagged him for separate questioning. Mr. Calloway, your security clearance was cosmic top secret, said a stern-faced woman who had introduced herself as Dr. Helen Park from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. You were working on Project Horizon. What can you tell us about it? Thomas stared at her, shell-shocked. How do you know about Project Horizon? That information was compartmentalized, Mr. Calloway. That project was declassified in 2001. What we need to know is whether your work had any connection to what happened to Flight 2758. Thomas ran his hands through his hair. Project Horizon was researching atmospheric electromagnetic anomalies for potential military applications. We were years away from any practical implementation. Dr. Park leaned forward. Were you aware of any tests scheduled for July 4th, 1963? Tests? No, absolutely not. We were strictly in the theoretical stage. Thomas paused, his engineer's mind racing despite the shock. Wait, you think Project Horizon had something to do with what happened to us? We're exploring all possibilities, Dr. Park replied diplomatically. Meanwhile, Eleanor Pearson and the other passengers had been moved to a secured wing of the base, converted into temporary living quarters. Military psychologists moved among them, offering support and gathering information. Eleanor sat alone by a window, watching planes take off and land on the distant runway. Everything looked different, bleaker, faster. A world advanced beyond her comprehension. Her new life in Los Angeles now existed only in a future that had already passed. "Miss Pearson?" A young female lieutenant approached. "There's someone here who would like to meet you." Eleanor turned, confused, as the lieutenant ushered in an elderly man in a wheelchair. He must have been in his late 80s, with wispy white hair and liver-spotted hands that trembled slightly. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice quavering with emotion. "You probably don't recognize me. I'm Richard Pearson, your husband." Eleanor's world tilted sideways. The man she had left just days ago, the 35-year-old. Richard, with his booming laugh and dark wavy hair, now sat before her as an old man approaching the end of his life. Her divorce papers, signed just before departure, were now ancient history. "Richard?" she whispered, unable to process what she was seeing. "This isn't possible." "I never remarried," he said simply. "I kept hoping someday they'd find you. When the military contacted me yesterday saying they'd found Flight 2758... I couldn't believe it." Tears streamed down his weathered face. 60 years, Ellie? 60 years, but you haven't aged a day." Across the facility, similar scenes played out as surviving family members, now elderly, were reunited with passengers who remained exactly as they had been in. 1,963. Children now older than their parents. Spouses who had mourned and moved on, confronted with ghosts from their past. The emotional toll was immeasurable. By evening, the passengers and crew had been gathered in a large conference room. General Martinez stood at the podium, flanked by medical personnel and government officials. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I know this situation is unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Our top scientists are working to understand exactly what happened to your aircraft. What we can tell you is that your disappearance 60 years ago sparked one of the most extensive investigations in aviation history." She gestured to a screen behind her, which displayed newspaper headlines from 1963. "Flight 2758 vanishes without a trace. 94 souls missing as search continues Bermuda Triangle of the skies. What happened to TC Flight 2758? The incident became one of the great aviation mysteries of the 20th century," Martinez continued. "Various theories emerged, from Soviet interference to alien abduction. The truth, as we're now discovering, appears to be far more complex." A murmur ran through the crowd. Captain Wilson stood up. "General, with all due respect, you're dancing around the central question. How did we travel through time, and why haven't we aged?" Martinez sighed. "Captain Wilson, the phenomenon you experienced has been theoretically documented but never confirmed until now. We believe Flight 2758 encountered what scientists call a temporal displacement field, potentially created by a combination of natural phenomena and possibly human intervention." Thomas Calloway's head snapped up at this. Project Horizon. Could their theoretical work have somehow contributed to this impossible situation? The guilt was already beginning to gnaw at him. "As for why you haven't aged," Martinez continued, "the working theory is that while 60 years passed for the rest of the world, for you and everyone on that aircraft, the journey was instantaneous. You existed ... elsewhere, outside of normal time. What happens to us now?" Eleanor asked, her voice small but steady. "Our homes, our jobs, our lives, they're all gone." Mr. Collins stepped forward. "The United States government acknowledges its responsibility to you all. New identities will be created, financial compensation provided, psychological support made available. A transition program has been developed to help you adjust to 2023. And what about those who don't want to adjust?" This came from Margaret, the flight attendant. "What about those of us who want to go home?" A heavy silence fell over the room. There was no home to return to. 1963 was as unreachable as the moon had been when they took off from Idlewild. Later that night, Thomas Calloway couldn't sleep. The temporary quarters were comfortable enough, but his mind raced with calculations and theories. If Project Horizon had somehow contributed to this disaster, he bore some responsibility. He needed answers. Slipping out of bed, he moved silently through the darkened hallway. Security was present, but focused primarily on keeping people out, not in. Thomas had spent enough time on military bases to know their layouts typically followed standard patterns. If there was a research division working on understanding what happened to Flight 2758, it would likely be in a restricted area. Using his outdated but still ingrained knowledge of military protocols, Thomas managed to make his way to a section of the base with heightened security. Through a window, he could see scientists working despite the late hour, examining what appeared to be pieces of the aircraft's instrumentation. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Calloway." The voice came from behind him. Thomas turned to find Mr. Collins standing there, somehow unsurprised. "Project Horizon," Thomas said simply. "It caused this, didn't it?" Collins studied him for a long moment. "Follow me." They walked in silence to a small, secure office. Collins closed the door and activated what Thomas recognized as a modern version of a sound-dampening field technology that had been theoretical in his time. In 1963, the military was indeed experimenting with electromagnetic field generation, building on your team's research, Collins began. Unbeknownst to most of the scientific community, a test was conducted on July 4, 1963, not anywhere near your flight path, but over the Nevada desert. Then how a natural phenomenon occurred simultaneously. A rare type of high-altitude electromagnetic storm that, when combined with the test's energy signature, created a cascading effect far beyond the test area. Thomas felt sick. You're saying our plane was caught in some kind of temporal disruption caused by Project Horizon? Not directly, but the combination of natural phenomena and the test created something unprecedented, something we've spent 60 years trying to understand. Collins opened a drawer and removed a classified folder. In 1977, another aircraft briefly disappeared from radar in almost the exact same circumstances. It reappeared 3 minutes later with the crew reporting instrument failures identical to what you described. That incident led us to develop monitoring systems for these temporal anomalies. You knew this could happen again, Thomas said accusingly. We suspected, but we could never predict where or when. Until yesterday, when our systems detected an incoming anomaly at the other end of the wormhole, so to speak, your flight arriving 60 years late. Thomas processed this information, his scientific mind grappling with implications beyond his training. Can it be reversed? Can you send us back? Collins' face provided the answer before his words did. The phenomenon was a natural occurrence amplified by technology we barely understood then and still don't fully comprehend now. We can't recreate it, and even if we could, the ethical implications of altering the timeline, L quotes, so we're stuck here. I'm afraid so. Mr. Calloway, as dawn broke over Peterson Air Force Base, the passengers and crew of Flight 2758 faced their first morning in a world 6 decades removed from everything they had known. For them, the sun had set in 1963 and risen in 2023. Their great temporal dislocation had only just begun. August 2023, 1 month since the impossible return of Flight 2758. The Rocky Mountain Rehabilitation Center, a repurposed luxury resort nestled in the Colorado wilderness, had become home to the 94 temporal refugees. Here, secluded from public scrutiny and media frenzy, they began the arduous process of adapting to life 6 decades in the future. Thomas Calloway stood on his balcony, watching a drone camera hover near the perimeter fence. Security remained tight, ostensibly for their protection, but Thomas suspected it was equally about containment. The government wasn't just helping them, it was studying them. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Helen Park entered, carrying a tablet computer. Over the past month, she had transitioned from interrogator to reluctant ally, providing Thomas with carefully cleared information about how Project Horizon had evolved after his disappearance. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she said. "I've brought something you might find interesting." She handed him the tablet. On the screen was a scientific paper, dated 1966. Theoretical Applications of Electromagnetic Disruption in Aviation Navigation. The author, Dr. Thomas Calloway. "I don't understand," he said, staring at his name. "I didn't write this. The military created it using your research notes and attributed it to you posthumously after flight. 2758 was declared lost," Dr. Park explained. "Your work became the foundation for an entire field of study." They couldn't acknowledge the classified aspects, of course, but they wanted your theoretical contributions recognized. Thomas scrolled through the paper, recognizing elements of his research twisted into conclusions he would never have reached. "They used my work to justify continued experimentation," he said flatly. Even after knowing what happened to our flight, Dr. Park had the grace to look uncomfortable. Different era, different ethical standards. "If it helps, your work eventually led to significant advancements in aviation safety systems that have saved thousands of lives. That's supposed to make me feel better. About being stranded 60 years in the future? Nothing will make that better, Mr. Calloway, but finding purpose might make it bearable across the facility." Eleanor Pearson was engaged in her daily future orientation session. Today's topic, digital technology and social media. The young instructor, barely in his 20s, was patiently explaining the concept of smartphones to the group. "So this device is simultaneously a telephone, camera, map, encyclopedia, post office, and entertainment center?" Eleanor clarified, turning the smartphone over in her hands. "The technology was simultaneously miraculous and overwhelming." "Exactly, Miss Pearson. And with social media apps, you can connect with people anywhere in the world instantly." Eleanor thought of her ex-husband, Richard. Their reunion had been brief and painful. 60 years had changed him into a stranger, one who had spent a lifetime mourning her while she had just left him days ago in her personal timeline. The temporal dissonance was too much for both of them. He had returned to his assisted living facility in Phoenix, leaving Eleanor to navigate this new world alone. Captain Wilson had taken to the future with surprising adaptability. His pilot's training had instilled in him an ability to assimilate new information quickly and adjust to changing circumstances. He spent hours in flight simulators, marveling at the advancements in aviation technology. The autopilot systems do most of the flying now, explained the Air Force instructor. Pilots are increasingly systems managers rather than hands-on controllers. Wilson nodded, absorbing this. And the aircraft we were flying, the DC-7, what happened to that model? Phased out by the late 1960s? Jet engines completely took over commercial aviation. Wilson ran his hand along the simulator's glass cockpit display. In my day, we joked that flying was hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Seems like you've engineered out most of the terror. Most of it, the instructor agreed with a smile. For flight attendant Margaret Sullivan, adaptation took a different form. At 25 in 1963, she had been engaged to be married, with the wedding planned for September of that year. Her fiancé, James, had passed away in 1998, never having married. He had left a letter for her should she ever be found, which the military had delivered to Margaret upon their return. I waited 10 years, the letter read, then 20. By our 30th anniversary that never was, people thought I was crazy for still believing you might be alive somewhere. Maybe I was, but I never stopped loving you, Margaret. Not for a single day. Margaret kept the letter under her pillow, reading it each night before sleep. During the day, she threw herself into learning everything about the modern world, as if making up for lost decades through sheer force of will. One evening in late August, the passengers and crew gathered in the center's main hall for their weekly community meeting. These sessions had become vital connection points, opportunities to share challenges and coping strategies. I went into town yesterday with my escort, announced elderly Mrs. Abernathy, who had been 72 when Flight 2758 disappeared. At 72, she was ironically now the youngest seeming among the original passengers. A young man called me vintage and asked to take a selfie with me. Apparently I'm what they call a vibe now. Laughter rippled through the group, genuine laughter, still rare but increasingly present as they found gallows humor in their shared predicament. Captain Wilson stood up next. I've been authorized to share some news. The government has reached a decision about our long-term situation. The room quieted immediately. Each of us will be given a choice, Wilson continued. Option 1, full integration into modern society with new identities, substantial financial support, and ongoing assistance. Option 2, a sheltered community. Essentially a small town created specifically for us, where we can live together in an environment that bridges our past with the present. Murmurs spread through the group. The second option, a protected bubble, seemed both appealing and disturbing. Thomas Calloway spoke up. What about option 3? Public acknowledgement of what happened to us. The truth. Wilson shook his head. That's not on the table, Thomas. The official story remains that Flight 2758 was recently discovered to have made an emergency landing in a remote area in 1963, with the passengers having lived in an isolated community until now. That's preposterous, Thomas objected. No one will believe that. You'd be surprised what people will believe when the alternative is accepting that time itself can be disrupted, interjected Dr. Park, who had been observing from the back of the room. The full truth would cause panic, religious crises, scientific upheaval, not to mention the military implications if other nations believe temporal displacement could be weaponized. Eleanor raised her hand. What about our original identities? I understand we can't reclaim our old lives, but some of us had family, property, legal claims. Are those all just gone? Wilson nodded grimly. Legally, we all died in 1963. Our assets were distributed, our identities administratively ended. The government will provide compensation. But our previous legal existence cannot be restored without revealing the truth. The reality of their situation settled heavily over the room. They were not just displaced in time, but effectively erased from their own era and reborn into this. One ghosts trying to solidify in a world that had moved on without them. After the meeting, Thomas found Eleanor sitting alone in the garden, watching hummingbirds flit between feeders, a small, normal miracle in a world where nothing else felt normal. What will you choose? He asked, sitting beside her. Over the past month, they had formed a friendship born of shared displacement and intellectual curiosity. Thomas admired Eleanor's quiet resilience, her ability to absorb each new shock with composed determination. I don't know, she admitted. The sheltered community feels like giving up, but full integration feels like drowning. She turned to face him. What about you? With your scientific background, you could probably adapt better than most of us. Thomas considered this. His knowledge was 60 years outdated, but his analytical skills remained sharp. I've been thinking about what Dr. Park said about finding purpose. Maybe there's a third way-in or the government's sanitized story. Not the full public truth, but something in between. What do you mean? I mean documenting what happened to us, scientifically, objectively. creating a record for the future when the world might be ready to know. Eleanor nodded slowly. A historian of our own impossible history. Exactly. Thomas hesitated, then added, I could use a partner in this. Someone with an eye for the human element that I might miss. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for perhaps the first time since their return. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Calloway? I suppose I am, Miss Pearson. As September arrived, the passengers and crew began making their choices. About 30 opted for the sheltered community, mostly older passengers and those with particularly traumatic reactions to the temporal displacement. The rest, including Thomas, Eleanor, Captain Wilson, and Margaret, chose integration with varying degrees of trepidation. The government provided each of them with new identities, comprehensive backstories, and enough financial resources to establish comfortable lives. Thomas was reintroduced to the world as Dr. Thomas Carver, a private research consultant with security clearance to access limited information about Flight 2758. Eleanor became Eleanor Phillips, a historical researcher specializing in mid-20th century American social dynamics. Their first apartment was in Denver, close enough to the rehabilitation center for continued support, but firmly in the real world. The building was specifically chosen for its mix of modern amenities and more traditional architecture that wouldn't feel entirely alien. Home sweet home, Eleanor said as they entered the furnished space. The government had attempted to blend contemporary necessities with vintage-inspired elements that might feel somewhat familiar. Thomas examined the smart home system controls with fascination. I suppose we should learn how to use all this. One day at a time, Eleanor replied pragmatically. It's all anyone can do. Their adaptation continued in fits and starts. Some technologies were intuitive, others baffling. Social norms had shifted in ways both liberating and confusing. Words had new meanings. Historical events they had yet to experience were common knowledge to everyone else. One October evening, Thomas returned home to find Eleanor deeply engrossed in historical archives on her tablets, specifically news coverage from the years immediately after their disappearance. Find anything interesting? He asked, setting down groceries. It found me, she said quietly, turning the screen toward him. It showed a newspaper article from 1964, Family of Flight 2758. Victim establishes scholarship fund. The article detailed how Eleanor's Vanessa had created a scholarship in her memory at the Boston school where she had taught. The fund had supported future teachers for decades. My parents never gave up hoping I was alive somewhere, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But they still made my disappearance mean something. Thomas sat beside her, offering silent support as she continued scrolling through the digital echoes of a life-interrupted memorials, anniversaries, gradual fading from public memory as Flight 2758 became just another unsolved mystery of aviation history. It's like reading your own obituary, she said finally. Except I'm still here. We're anomalies, Thomas agreed. Neither fully of the past nor truly of the present. Eleanor closed the tablet. Then perhaps we should focus on the future. It's the only time frame we might actually belong in as autumn deepened. The temporal refugees of Flight 2758 continued their remarkable journey of adaptation. For them, the passage of time had become both meaningless and all-consuming. 60 years condensed to a moment, and every day since stretched into an eternity of adjustment. They were unwitting pioneers on the frontier of human experience, navigating a displacement no one had ever survived before. And in a secure government facility miles away, scientists continued to study the data from their return, searching for patterns that might predict when, not if, another temporal anomaly might occur. For if Flight 2758 could return from nowhere, what else might the fractured fabric of time eventually release? April 2024, 9 months since the return of Flight 2758, Thomas stood before a classroom of graduate students at Colorado State University, carefully writing equations on a whiteboard. His new identity as Dr. Thomas Carver, specialist in theoretical physics with a focus on electromagnetic field theory, had provided unexpected purpose. The government had arranged this visiting professor position partly to give him meaningful work, partly to keep him under observation, and partly to benefit from his unique perspective on physics. The key, he explained to the rapt students, is understanding that what we perceive as immutable constants may actually be variable under certain extreme conditions. None of the students knew his true identity, of course. To them, he was merely a somewhat old-fashioned professor with occasionally outdated references but brilliant theoretical insights. They attributed his analog preferences and technology struggles to eccentricity rather than temporal displacement. After class, Thomas checked his phone, still a daily challenge despite months of practice. A message from Eleanor lit up the screen. Library archive access approved. Meeting with Wilson at 6. Big news. Since their integration into modern society, Thomas and Eleanor had continued their unofficial documentation project. Captain Wilson had joined their efforts, along with a small group of other passengers committed to understanding what had happened to them. They operated with tacit government approval provided they shared all findings and maintained absolute public secrecy. That evening, Thomas arrived at their favorite meeting spot, a quiet corner of a downtown Denver coffee shop where the ambient noise provided good cover for sensitive conversations. Eleanor was already there, her tablet displaying scanned documents from the 1960s. "You won't believe what I found," she said by way of greeting. "Transit logs from Idlewild Airport, JFK, now from July 1963. "How's that significant?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair. "Because according to these logs, there were 2 Flight 2758s scheduled that day." Thomas stared at her. "That's impossible. Transcontinental never ran duplicate flight numbers." "Exactly." Eleanor pointed to the entry. "The first 2758 departed at 14:35 hours, our flight. The second was scheduled for 2200 hours, same route, but it was canceled after our disappearance." "Could be a clerical error," Thomas suggested, though his mind was already racing with implications. "That's what I thought too, until I cross-referenced with air traffic control logs. They showed 2 distinct flight plans filed for the same number. And here's the kicker. The second flight had a different aircraft assigned, but the exact same passenger manifest." Thomas felt a chill run through him. "Eleanor, are you suggesting that there were 2 of each of us?" "I don't know. But something very strange was happening at Transcontinental Airways in the summer of 1963. Captain Wilson arrived, looking energized despite the late hour. At 58, when Flight 2758 disappeared, he was now physically the oldest among them at 59, though chronologically they should all be well over 100. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into a chair. "I've been at Peterson meeting with General Martinez. They've made a breakthrough in understanding what happened to us." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. "What kind of breakthrough?" Thomas asked cautiously. "They found another plane," Wilson said, lowering his voice. "A small private aircraft that disappeared in 1978 and reappeared yesterday in Nebraska. 2 people aboard, pilot and passenger. Same circumstances. Instruments failed. Strange cloud formation. Temporal displacement. Except they only jumped forward 46 years instead of our 60. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Are you saying this is still happening?" "It's happened at least 3 times that they know of. Ours was the first. The 1978 incident was the second. And now this one." "They're accelerating," Thomas said, the scientist in him immediately recognizing the pattern. "The gap between incidents is shrinking." Wilson nodded grimly. "Martinez thinks there could be more coming. They've established a special task force called Kronos to monitor for temporal anomalies and prepare for potential arrivals." "Did they tell the new arrivals about us?" Eleanor asked. "No. They're keeping each incident compartmentalized. Official story is the same: emergency landing, isolated community recently discovered." Thomas frowned. "That story might work once, maybe twice. But if these incidents continue, ... double quotes, he shook his head. "We need to know what's causing this." "That's where it gets interesting," Wilson replied. The working theory now involves something called quantum entanglement between parallel timelines." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Parallel timelines? That sounds like science fiction," says the man who skipped 6 decades in the blink of an eye. Eleanor pointed out dryly. "Fair point," Thomas conceded. "But multiple timelines would imply a fundamental restructuring of our understanding of physics." "Which is exactly why the government is keeping this quiet," Wilson said. "The implications are staggering. But there's more." He pulled out his own tablet and pulled up a classified document he'd been authorized to share with them. "Project Horizon didn't end after your disappearance, Thomas. It evolved into something called Project Janus in the 1970s. Thomas scrolled through the document, his expression darkening. "They continued experimenting despite knowing what happened to us." "They continued because of what happened to you," Wilson corrected. "The military became convinced that temporal displacement could be weaponized or harnessed. Project Janus was specifically tasked with attempting to recreate the conditions that caused Flight 2758 to vanish." Eleanor looked horrified. "Are they saying these new incidents are the result of their experiments?" "Not directly. The theory is more complex. They believe their experiments created weak points in the fabric of spacetime. Natural phenomena-specific types of electromagnetic storms can trigger these weak points to open temporarily, creating what they call temporal corridors." Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing this information. "Show me the data on the electromagnetic storms," he finally said. "If there's a pattern, I might be able to identify it." Wilson hesitated. "That's highly classified, Thomas." "I'm not sure I can get access. Then we need to speak directly with General Martinez," Thomas insisted. "If these incidents are accelerating, more people will be displaced. We have a unique perspective that could help them understand what's happening." Later that week, Thomas, Eleanor, and Wilson found themselves back at Peterson Air Force Base, meeting with General Martinez and the newly formed Kronos Task Force. The secure conference room was filled with screens displaying global weather patterns. electromagnetic field measurements, and complex algorithms monitoring for anomalies. Dr. Carver, Ms. Phillips, Captain Wilson Martinez greeted them, using their new identities even in this secure environment, a reminder that their original selves remained officially deceased. "Thank you for agreeing to consult on this matter. We appreciate being included," Thomas replied. "Though I'm troubled by what Captain Wilson has shared about Project Janus." Martinez's expression remained neutral. "Project Janus was before my time, but I understand your concerns. Our focus now is not on exploiting these phenomena, but on predicting and managing them to minimize harm." "How many potential arrivals are you anticipating?" Eleanor asked. A scientist stepped forward, Dr. Eli Novak, the task force's lead physicist. "Based on our models, we've identified 7 potential temporal corridors that may be active. 3 correspond to known displacement events, yours in 1963, the incident in 1978, and the most recent arrival from 1986. 1986? Thomas questioned. Wilson mentioned 1978. Martinez looked uncomfortable. "There was another arrival last night. A commercial helicopter with 4 people aboard disappeared while surveying pipeline infrastructure in Alaska in 1986. It appeared in nearly the same location 38 years later. The displacement periods are decreasing," Thomas observed. 60 years, 46 years, 38 years. The temporal corridors are becoming more efficient somehow. Dr. Novak nodded. "Exactly. And based on our projections, the next arrival could come from the 1990s, with a displacement of approximately 30 years. Do you have any way to predict when these arrivals will occur?" Eleanor asked. "We're tracking specific electromagnetic storm formations," Novak gesturing to a global map with several highlighted areas. "When these storms reach certain parameters, they can potentially activate the temporal corridors." Thomas studied the map intently. "These locations aren't random. They follow a pattern. We've noticed that as well," Novak agreed. "The corridors appear to be distributed along specific geomagnetic lines." "No," Thomas shook his head. "It's more specific than that." He pointed to the location. "These correspond almost exactly to the Project Horizon test sites from 1963. The room fell silent. Martinez and Novak exchanged significant glances. "That information wasn't in the briefing materials," Thomas added pointedly. Martinez sighed. "Project Horizon conducted tests at 7 locations globally between 1962 and 1964. You're correct. They align with our currently identified temporal corridors." "So the government did cause this," Eleanor said, her voice tight with anger. "It's more complicated than that," Novak interjected. "The tests created potential weak points, but they've remained dormant for decades. Something has changed in the last year that's causing them to activate." "What's changed?" Wilson asked. Novak hesitated before responding. "Solar activity has entered an unusually intense phase. The current solar maximum is the most powerful recorded since observations began. The electromagnetic storms triggering these events are directly related to massive solar ejection." Thomas's mind was racing, connecting dots across 6 decades of scientific advancement. "You're saying natural solar activity is interacting with man-made weak points in space-time to create these temporal corridors?" "Precisely," Novak confirmed. "And based on solar forecast models, this activity will peak in approximately 2 months." "How many more people might be displaced?" Eleanor asked, ever focused on the human impact. "That's impossible to predict with certainty," Martinez replied. "But we're preparing for potentially dozens of arrivals from various time periods." Thomas leaned forward. "What if there's another possibility you haven't considered? What if the corridors don't just work in one direction?" The room grew very quiet. "You're suggesting temporal displacement could work in reverse?" Novak asked carefully. "That people from our time could be sent back? Or that those of us who came forward might have a way back?" Thomas clarified. Martinez shook her head firmly. "Even if theoretically possible, attempting to send people back in time creates insurmountable paradoxes and ethical issues. The timeline has already adjusted to your disappearance. Returning would create potentially catastrophic discontinuities." Thomas wasn't convinced, but he recognized the government's position wouldn't change easily. "At minimum, we should be preparing for the psychological impact on new arrivals. Our experience could help develop better protocols for integration. That's precisely why we've asked for your involvement," Martinez agreed. "We want to establish a comprehensive support system for temporal displaced persons." The meeting continued for hours as they discussed predictions, preparations, and protocols. By the end, Thomas, Eleanor, and Wilson had been officially incorporated into the Kronos task forces, consultants giving them access to information while keeping them under close supervision. As they left the base, Eleanor turned to Thomas. "You don't really believe we could go back, do you?" Thomas was thoughtful. "I don't know, but I'm not convinced it's impossible." Wilson joined them. "Even if it were possible, would you want to go back? To a world without all this technology, knowledge, medical advancement?" "It's not about what world is better," Thomas replied. "It's about where we belong." Over the next month, their lives became consumed by work with the Kronos task force. As predicted, more arrivals occurred, a military transport plane from 1991, a fishing boat from 1997, even a group of hikers from 2001 who had disappeared in a remote mountain range. Each arrival followed the same pattern: electromagnetic storm activity over one of the 7 identified corridors, followed by the appearance of people and vehicles that had vanished from history. The government's resources were stretched maintaining secrecy around these events. Cover stories became increasingly elaborate and difficult to maintain. Media speculation grew as strange weather phenomena and unusual military activity were reported near the corridor sites. In early June, Thomas was working late in his makeshift lab at the Kronos facility when Eleanor burst in, looking shaken. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "I found something in the archives," she said, her voice unsteady. "Something about Flight 2758 that changes everything." Thomas led her to a chair. "Tell me." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I have been cross-referencing passenger manifests with historical records, trying to create complete profiles of everyone on our flight. I found something odd about Transcontinental Airways itself." "What about it?" "The airline doesn't exist in the historical record before 1961, and it disappeared completely by 1965. 2 years of operation, then gone without a trace." Thomas frowned. "That can't be right. Transcontinental was one of the major carriers. I flew with them dozens of times throughout the late 50s. That's just it. According to every historical record, the airline didn't exist before 1961. I checked with the FAA archives, industry publications, everything. Transcontinental Airways appears suddenly in 1961, operates for exactly 26 months, then vanishes after Flight 2758 disappears." Thomas tried to process this information. Could records have been lost or purged? I considered that. But then I found this. Eleanor showed him a classified military document from 1965, marked with Project Janus headers. It referenced Operation Carrier and described Transcontinental Airways as the transportation mechanism for Phase 1 temporal displacement trials. Thomas stared at the document in disbelief. "Are you saying the entire airline was a military front?" "I think it was created specifically to test temporal displacement technology," Eleanor said grimly. "And I think we were part of the experiment all along." The implications were staggering. If Eleanor was correct, their displacement hadn't been an accident but an intentional test with 94 unwitting human subjects. "We need to take this to Martinez," Thomas said finally. "Will she even acknowledge it?" Eleanor asked. "This goes beyond classified. It's a government atrocity." Before Thomas could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The intercom crackled. "All Kronos personnel to the operations center immediately. Temporal event in progress." They rushed to the operations center, finding it in controlled chaos. Screens showed massive electromagnetic storm activity over 4 of the 7 corridors simultaneously. "What's happening?" Thomas asked Dr. Novak, who was coordinating response teams. "Unprecedented solar activity," Novak explained tensely. "The largest coronal mass ejection ever recorded hit Earth's magnetosphere 20 minutes ago. It's activating multiple corridors at once." General Martinez spotted them and waved them over. "We've got confirmed temporal events at 4 locations. Multiple vehicles appearing from various time periods. But there's something else. We're getting energy signatures indicating potential bidirectional corridors." "Bidirectional?" Thomas repeated. "You mean objects from our time may be disappearing into the past?" Martinez confirmed grimly. "We've lost contact with monitoring stations near 2 of the corridors." As they watched, the main screen displayed live satellite imagery of a commercial airliner appearing seemingly out of nowhere in Colorado, airspace materializing through swirling clouds that hadn't been there seconds before. Continental Airlines Flight 3077, an analyst called out, disappeared en route from Denver to Chicago in 2002. "Get air traffic control to vector emergency landing at Peterson," Martinez ordered. Medical teams standing by. Thomas's mind was racing. If the corridors were bidirectional and multiple were active simultaneously, the implications were enormous. He turned to Eleanor, about to share his thoughts, when another alarm sounded. "Temporal signature intensifying at the Alaska corridor," an analyst reported. "It's off the charts." The satellite feed shifted to show a massive storm system forming over the Alaskan wilderness. Swirling clouds shot through with unusual lightning. The electromagnetic readings were unlike anything they'd seen with previous events. "It's destabilizing," Novak said, his voice tense. "The corridor is expanding beyond predicted parameters." As they watched in stunned silence, the storm suddenly collapsed in on itself with a flash of light so bright it temporarily overloaded the satellite sensors. When the image cleared, there was no sign the storm had ever existed. "What just happened?" Martinez demanded. "Unknown," Novak replied, checking readings. The energy signature completely disappeared. "It's as if the corridor closed itself." An analyst called out, "General, we're receiving reports of a commercial aircraft appearing near the Alaska corridor location." "Another arrival? Identification?" The analyst looked up, confusion evident on his face. That's the thing, ma'am. According to preliminary reports, it's Transcontinental Airways Flight 2758. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged shocked glances. That's impossible, Martinez said. Flight 2758 is here. You're here. Unless ... double quotes Thomas began, his scientific mind already formulating a theory. Unless it's not the same Flight 2758. Explain, Martinez demanded. Eleanor discovered that there were two Flight 2758s scheduled on July 4, 1963, Thomas said. What if both flights encountered temporal corridors? What if we came from one timeline and this new arrival comes from another? The operations center fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Are you suggesting parallel timelines are collapsing into one another? Novak asked. Before Thomas could answer, another alarm sounded, this one different, more urgent. Multiple temporal signatures forming, an analyst called out. All 7 corridors activating simultaneously. The main screen showed global imagery of storm systems forming at each corridor location, growing in intensity with unprecedented speed. It's a cascade effect, Thomas realized aloud. The corridors are resonating with each other, amplifying the temporal displacement field. What does that mean in practical terms? Martinez asked sharply. It means the boundaries between timelines are becoming increasingly unstable, Thomas, watching the data with growing alarm. If this continues, we could see massive temporal displacements, people and objects from various time periods appearing randomly, perhaps even geographic transposition between timelines. How do we stop it? Eleanor asked. Thomas looked at her, then at Wilson, who had joined them. I'm not sure we can, but I have a theory about what might stabilize the corridors. I'm listening, Martinez said. The original Project Horizon experiments created these weak points. Each subsequent activation has made them more unstable. But what if we could reset them? Return elements to their original positions in space-time. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. You mean return us Flight 2758 to 1963? Thomas nodded. If my theory is correct, our displacement was the first domino. Reversing it might halt the cascade. That's an enormous risk based on an unproven theory, Martinez. Look at your screens, General, Thomas countered. The situation is already out of control. What's your alternative? As they debated, the temporal signatures continued to intensify. Reports flooded in of strange appearances across the globe, vehicles, buildings, even geographical features suddenly materializing where nothing had been moments before. The fabric of reality itself seemed to be fracturing. Even if I agreed to your theory, Martinez said finally, how would you implement it? We have no mechanism to control these corridors. We have Flight 2758, Thomas replied simply. Our aircraft, the original one that brought us here, has been preserved in a hangar at Area 51 since our arrival, hasn't it? Martinez's expression confirmed his suspicion. If we can get our original aircraft to the Colorado corridor during peak activation, the temporal resonance might pull us back to our original departure point. You're asking me to authorize sending 94 people on a suicide mission based on theoretical physics. Even our best scientists don't fully understand, Martinez said incredulously. I'm asking you to give us the choice, Thomas corrected. Everyone on that flight has already lost everything once. Let us decide if we're willing to risk it again to prevent a global catastrophe. Martinez was silent for a long moment, weighing impossible options as alarms continued to sound around them. Finally, she nodded. I'll need presidential authorization, but I'll recommend the operation proceed. Within hours, Operation Restoration was underway. The original Flight 2758, aircraft preserved for study these past 9 months, was being prepared for flight at a secure facility in Nevada. Captain Wilson would pilot with his original first officer and flight crew. The passengers gathered in a hangar being briefed on what little was known about the plan. The risks were enormous. There was no guarantee they would reach 1963 intact, or that their return would stabilize the temporal corridors. But the alternative seemed worse, remaining in a world increasingly fractured by collapsing timelines. Eleanor found Thomas at the edge of the group, reviewing calculations on his tablet. Do you really think this will work? She asked quietly. Scientifically speaking, it's our best theory, with extremely limited data, he admitted. But something feels right about it. Like we're correcting an imbalance. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about what we discovered about Transcontinental being a military operation. What if we were chosen specifically? What if none of this was accidental? Does it matter now? Thomas asked. Whether we were victims of an experiment or a natural phenomenon, we still have the same choice to make. I suppose you're right. Eleanor looked around at the other passengers, some frightened, some resolute, all facing an impossible decision. Will you go back? Thomas met her gaze. I will. My work in this time is important, but if there's a chance I can help prevent further displacements, I have to try. He paused. What about you? I think I will too, Eleanor said after a moment. 1963 wasn't perfect, but it was where I was supposed to be. This world, for all its wonders, never quite felt like mine. As midnight approached, The passengers and crew of Flight 2758 boarded their restored aircraft, now retrofitted with modern tracking equipment and communication system. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom, steady despite the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As you've been briefed, we're attempting something unprecedented, a deliberate temporal displacement flight. Our destination is July 4th, 1963, the day we left. I won't pretend to understand the science, but I believe in our mission. If successful, we may prevent further temporal disruptions and allow everyone to return to their rightful places in time." Thomas sat in his original seat, 14C. Eleanor had moved to sit beside him, having exchanged places with another passenger. Through the windows, they could see military personnel clearing the runway. Above, the night sky churned with unusual cloud formations illuminated by strange lightning, the temporal corridor forming. "Ready for another impossible journey?" Thomas asked, offering his hand. Eleanor took it, her grip firm. As ready as anyone could be. The engines roared to life, the sound somehow both familiar and distant, like a half-remembered dream. Flight 2758 taxied down the runway and lifted into the turbulent night sky, climbing steadily toward the heart of the temporal storm. In the operations center, General Martinez and Dr. Novak watched flight telemetry data as the aircraft approached the active corridor. "Temporal energy readings are spiking," Novak reported. "The corridor is fully formed. Flight 2758. You are cleared to proceed," Martinez radioed. "Godspeed." Wilson's voice came back, slightly distorted. "Acknowledged. We are entering the formation now." Instruments beginning to fluctuate. The aircraft plunged into swirling clouds shot through with prismatic lightning. Inside, the passengers experienced the same sequence of events as before, compass spinning wildly. Radio static, the brief moment of absolute silence and stillness. In the operations center, alarms blared as monitoring systems overloaded. "We've lost telemetry," an analyst called out. "Radar contact lost," another reported. On the main screen, satellite imagery showed the storm system collapsing in on itself, dissipating with unnatural speed until only clear night sky remained. Flight 2758 was gone. For several tense minutes, everyone waited for some indication of what had happened. Then, one by one, the alerts for other temporal corridors began to quiet. The readings stabilized. The anomalies decreased. "It's working," Novak said in disbelief, checking global readings. "The temporal cascade is reversing. Corridors are stabilizing." Martinez stared at the empty sky where Flight 2758 had vanished. "Did they make it back to 1963? We may never know for certain," Novak replied. "But the theory appears correct. Their return has stabilized the temporal rifts." In the weeks that followed, the temporal displacement events ceased entirely. The 7 corridors remained as weak points in spacetime, monitored constantly, but no further anomalies were detected. The crisis had passed, at least for now. The world would never know how close it had come to temporal collapse, or the sacrifice made by 94 people who chose to return to a past they had already lived through. History recorded only that several unusual weather phenomena had occurred globally, briefly disrupting communications and transportation. Project Kronos continued its work in secret, developing protocols for possible future incidents, while researching the fundamental nature of time itself. The official files on Flight 2758 were sealed at the highest classification level, accessible only to those with direct operational need. But in a small government archive, a single document remained as testimony to what had transpired. It was a handwritten letter, composed by Thomas Calloway hours before the final flight and entrusted to General Martinez. It read, "To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, then our mission to return Flight 2758 to its original time has likely succeeded. I write this not knowing if we will survive the journey or if our theory is correct, but compelled by the hope that our experience might serve those who come after us. Time is not the linear progression we once believed. It is a complex tapestry of intersecting possibilities, normally separated but occasionally connected through what we have called temporal corridors. Our displacement was perhaps the first documented case of human passage through such a corridor, but I doubt it will be the last. The work we began with Project Horizon in the 1960s has consequences far beyond what we could have imagined. I urge future researchers to proceed with caution. The boundaries between timelines are more fragile than we knew, and the human cost of tampering with them is immeasurable. If our return stabilizes the temporal anomalies as we hope, please remember that 94 people chose to leave behind the future to preserve it. We return to 1963 not knowing what awaits us, whether we will create an alternate timeline or simply resume our original journey as if nothing happened. Perhaps in some version of history, Flight 2758 will land safely in Los Angeles on July 4th, 1963. Perhaps in another we will vanish forever. Whatever becomes of us, I am at peace with our decision. We were out of place in time, anomalies in a world not our own. In returning, we restore balance, not just to the temporal corridors, but to ourselves. Time will tell if we were right. Dr. Thomas Calloway, Dr. Thomas Carver, June 15, 2024. The letter was filed away. A quiet testimony to an impossible journey and the 94 souls who chose to set time right, even at the cost of their own futures. And somewhere, perhaps in another timeline altogether, Flight 2758 continued its journey across the skies of 1960, carrying passengers who remembered a future that might never come to pass.